Okay, I think I see there are over 35 participants with us now, so we'll start and hopefully others can join us along the way. So I want to extend an extremely warm welcome to all. Thank you for joining our roundtable discussion today on addressing weapons in conflict-related sexual violence prevention and response. And we're going to be discussing this broadly, but we're also have the opportunity to look specifically at how this applies in the case of Sudan, and we have some wonderful experts with us to explore that today. My name is Lindsay Forsland, and I'm the Deputy Coordinator of the UN Action Against Sexual Violence and Conflict Network. We're a network that works under the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. And for those who may not be that familiar with the work of UN Action, the network currently brings together 25 UN entities across the humanitarian, peace building, and development nexus to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. And we are really delighted to be co-organizing today an event on the occasion of the 16 days of activism against GBV with UNIDIR. Before we get started, I would like to share a few housekeeping rules. The event is being recorded and will be shared on UNIDIR's YouTube channel and UN Action's website following the event. At the end of presentations, there will be time for questions and answers. For the Q&A portion, if you would like to take the floor, we kindly ask that you use the raised hand function. Once your name has been called by the moderator, you will be able to use your microphone and ask your question to the panel. In the interest of time, we do ask that you keep your interventions short and focused on a specific question for the speakers. You may also type your question directly into the Q&A box, which the moderator will then read out to the panel. Thank you very much, and I will now hand you over to Anna-Lena, who is the first Secretary and Women, Peace and Security expert of the Permanent Mission of Switzerland to the United Nations here in New York to help kick off our discussion. Anna-Lena, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. It is really a great honor to welcome you today to this roundtable discussion on addressing weapons in CRSV prevention and response with a focus on Sudan, and I would like to thank you, the organizers, very much for setting up this important event in the context of the 16 days of activism, and I'm very excited for the speakers and experts to start and shed a light on why linking these topics of CRSV and weapons is so important, and hopefully also what some of the concrete avenues we can address in the case of Sudan. I really think what we do here today is timely and urgent because we're addressing still kind of a massive gap and a missing link, and that is between these two topics. We need to address SGBV, CRSV, and their prevention in a holistic way. And that includes, on the one hand, the integration of arms control and disarmament into the prevention and response to SGBV. And on the other hand, this means the integration of SGBV and CRSV prevention and response considerations into arms control and disarmament instruments, policies, and discussions. So we're doing this today, and I think what we're also doing is that we're reinforcing the synergies between somewhat siloed expert communities, and I'm very happy to know that today we are joined by gender, women, peace and security, and disarmament experts. I also wanted to express that I'm very impressed and thankful that we have a chance today to dive deeper on the link between weapons and CRSV by looking at a concrete case study, because we also need to become more specific and concrete in how we address these issues. And Sudan is an important focus. It is one of the most devastating conflicts today, which has received and is receiving less and less public attention. We are probably all aware that the reports of escalating gender-based and sexual violence used as a tool of war, often coming out of Sudan, are increasing. They're horrific and heartbreaking. And many of these reports do actually contain quite a lot of details on the use or the threat of use of weapons. And while this may not come as a surprise and is in a way maybe not news to many people here in the room, this is really important that we start looking at the use of weapons more strategically and holistically. And of course, this also includes the participation and the increase of participation of women and broader civil society in policy discussions and decisions on arms control and disarmament. So Lindsay mentioned I work for the permanent mission of Switzerland. We are currently a member on the Security Council, and we are very committed to mainstreaming the women, peace and security agenda, including the prevention of SGBV in the Council's work. Also wanted to flag that next week we will have an open debate in the Security Council on small arms. This will be an important opportunity, again, I think for many of us to raise the attention on the issue, and I'm sure we will be able to draw on a lot of the insights of our roundtable today. And Switzerland is also co-chairing the informal expert working group on women, peace and security, where we facilitate comprehensive discussions on specific country contexts and are always eager to articulate the link between weapons and SGBV better. For that, of course, we need more thorough data collection, more research and evidence-based, everything we get out of this discussion here. And I think in the case of Sudan, but of course also in other contexts, monitoring, data collection, documentation, and reporting continues to be crucially important in general, but also especially in the context of mission drawdowns and here the withdrawal of UNITAMs. So let me stop here and thank you again for bringing us together today. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and the inputs from our experts. Thank you.
Thank you, Annalena, for highlighting the importance and timeliness of our discussion today. I'm Frida Thomason, and I will moderate the discussion today for the next hour and a half on behalf of UN Action. And I'm a political affairs officer at the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, and also our UN Action focal point for ODA since 2019, when UNODA joined UN Action in a step to bridge arms control and conflict-related sexual violence prevention. And last year, the UN Action Network launched the framework for the prevention of CRSV, which for the first time articulated the relevance of arms control and disarmament for preventing conflict-related sexual violence. And these connections might seem clear, but there is still much to do when it comes to the prevention of CRSV through arms control and disarmament measures. And you can see in the chat the prevention framework. So there are countless examples of where the proliferation of weapons risk fueling sexual violence in conflict across the world. And today we bring the attention to Sudan, although we could have been talking about many other countries as well, such as the DRC, Haiti, Iraq, Ukraine, Myanmar. But today's event is really an opportunity to examine these entry points for arms control and disarmament into the CRSV efforts in general. And also to look at these efforts that are led by the UN, regional organizations, civil society. And as Annalena mentioned, on our panel, we're lucky to have both UN experts on arms control and on CRSV experts, as well as representatives from Sudan and Sudanese civil society, been working for many years on preventing and responding to gender-based violence. So without further delay, I'll just briefly introduce our panelists. Here with us today, you'll see on the screen, we have Mayada Adil, who in 2022 was elected to be one of the UN's young leaders for the Sustainable Development Goals. And Mayada is a medical doctor, fashion designer, women's rights advocate for health equity, and a refugee rights activist. And she has worked on campaigns focused on ending gender-based violence in Sudan and in Mali, and recently in September briefed the UN Security Council on sexual violence in Sudan. We also have Sulaima Ishaq El-Khalifa, who is the head of violence against women unit at the Ministry of Social Development. And she's worked also for many years advocating for legislative change, which could recognize gender-based violence in Sudanese law and give protection to victims. Since the beginning of this conflict, she's been documenting the widespread and systematic use of CRSV all over the country. We're also joined by Sven Pfeiffer, the UN Action Focal Point from the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes, the UNODC, and his colleague Max Menn. And finally, here with us today, we have Hana Salama, who is the Gender and Disarmament Research at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, and author of the UNIDIR report addressing weapons in conflict-related sexual violence, the Arms Control and Disarmament Toolbox. So with this brief introduction, I'd like to first give the floor to Hana to introduce us to this topic and share the findings of UNIDIR's recent report. Thank you, Hana, over to you.
Thanks, Frida. Allow me to share my screen because I have a presentation, and thank you very much, everyone, for taking time out of your day to come and discuss this issue. I'm not sure if you can see the slide now fully, I believe. So as Frida said, I work for UNIDIR, and apologies for all of the acronyms. It's the Institute for Disarmament Research. For those of you who are joining us from across the UN system, you may have not heard of us. We are quite a small research organization, and we try to support member states with evidence and analyses that they can take when discussing arms control and disarmament processes. The gender team is even smaller. We're a transversal program, and we work with all of our programs to integrate gender perspectives and to advocate for gender equality in arms control and disarmament. Just for this presentation, I would like to firstly present to you the findings of our report addressing conflict-related sexual violence, the Arms Control and Disarmament Toolbox. Then present to you the proposed Arms Control and Disarmament Toolbox, which is more of a conceptual framework, and then finally share the some thoughts and some ideas that we can discuss in the discussion portion, which could help us kind of concretize this topic. Now, let's see, does this work? Yeah. I just, before I start, wanted to give you a background about why UNIDIR decided to embark in this work. Across several country reports and also in general reports on conflict-related sexual violence, the UN Secretary General has recognized that the proliferation of small arms and light weapons is one of the factors fueling systematic and widespread sexual violence in conflict. Beyond this recognition, however, and beyond the framework, which came out in September 2022, we didn't see so much concretization of this integration between arms control and disarmament and CRSV. So we thought to kind of address this gap by first exploring through an evidence base the linkages between small arms and light weapons and CRSV. And secondly, based on these linkages, providing entry points where arms control measures, tools, frameworks can be better leveraged to support prevention. Now, just a quick overview of the key findings. We basically found that the relationship is both direct and indirect between small arms and light weapons and sexual violence. The direct links are quite obvious. Weapons and ammunition are used by perpetrators to commit rape, threaten or coerce individuals into sexual acts against their will, injure or kill victims and survivors of sexual violence. The indirect links are also maybe less clear. However, they are proliferation contributes to fueling armed conflict, which in turn propagates the conditions that lead to sexual violence in conflict. And here there's been studies and many examples of these indirect links in the DRC and South Sudan, which found that conflict conditions that lead to the conflict or to any other type of violence, such as increased militarization and the proliferation of weapons, also leads to increased domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And this is a really important point because we really view sexual violence as part of a spectrum of gender-based violence, which unfortunately probably predated the conflict and then will continue throughout and possibly after. And throughout the spectrum, we see that the role of small arms are the same. And here I'd like to share some of the data. So first of all, finding data on conflict-related sexual violence in general is pretty difficult. Here we have a table of sort of publicly available data, and already you can see that the total number of incidents, what is collected in terms of information really varies quite significantly. And not many organizations are for now collecting information or involving weapons or information related to weapons. We did have one organization that did identify firearms as part of their recording of incidents, and this is Insecurity Insight. And here we saw that based on their data, between 70 and 90% of incidents of CRSV in those 6 countries which are listed, which is the DRC, Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Sudan, Sudan, and Ukraine, have involved a weapon. And here they actually specify involving a firearm. So we see this as a pretty high rate of correlation. So based on this, we proposed an arms control and disarmament toolbox, which looks at structural or long-term prevention, as well as short-term and more operational prevention. So here you have sort of a conceptual framing of this. At the bottom is the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms, the Arms Trade Treaty, and the Firearms Protocol, which really underpin long-term prevention. And I'm sure my colleagues from UNODC will speak more about this, but I just wanted to give an example on the Arms Trade Treaty. The treaty is a legally binding treaty, and potentially it's one of the most important treaties for preventing conflict-related sexual violence because it prohibits states to transfer weapons where there is widespread violations of human rights and international humanitarian law violations. And here, I think that the interpretation of this is pretty clear. CRSV has been including as a serious violation of human rights and IHL. And under a separate article, the ATT also asked states to mitigate measures or assess the risk of weapons being used to facilitate gender-based violence and mitigate such risks. So here we can say that CRSV is clearly covered under 2 articles, and this could really help with long-term prevention measures. And then if we look at sort of more operational preventions, these tools that we have are being leveraged at different points of the conflict. So for example, in the early phases, we can consider arms-related risks in early warning mechanisms on CRSV. We can improve data collection on weapons. So we had some examples of this in the research. So actions that were based on information of CRSV incidents, including civilian weapons holding, which prompted, for example, the mission in South Sudan to conduct weapons collection programs or also set up weapons-free zones. And I think they also mentioned that these weapons-free zones were effective in reducing the rate of CRSV in the protection sites. During the conflict, there can be engagement with armed actors. So for example, through the Office of the Special Representative on Sexual Violence, through joint communiques or unilateral communiques where these issues can be addressed. And there can also be arms embargoes that can be applied in the context of sanction regimes, which can limit the number of arms available in a state and can really reduce the access of these weapons to perpetrators. And then when we move on to more transitional settings, there are measures and tools that we also have in the toolbox, which can prevent sort of more immediately and in the long term, the reoccurrence of conflict-related sexual violence. So things like civilian disarmament, DDR, SSR, these tools are being applied currently, but not necessarily looking at, not necessarily taking into account the risk of CRSV or taking it into account in a limited way. So for example, in terms of DDR programs, the first D doesn't really address CRSV, but it could do so by including women and survivors associations in disarmament campaigns and weapons collection programs by raising awareness on these issues. And for example, SSR could also address different policies on when and how, or even if members of the security forces can take their weapons home. And this is a really good measure to reduce domestic violence as well, especially in a post-conflict environment. Other measures such as weapons and ammunition management, yes, they do deal with the physical security of weapons stockpile. They try to prevent diversion, again, the diversion of weapons, which can lead to gender-based violence or conflict-related sexual violence. But if we look at WAM holistically, it can also be used to address frameworks which regulate civilian gun licensing, and have sort of more gender responsive civilian licensing to prevent gender-based violence in the future and specifically domestic violence. So this kind of provided a brief overview of the findings and the conceptual framework and ideas that we are suggesting. But I think as I said, the toolbox should be used, but there are a few things to consider. First, it would be, as Anna-Lena had mentioned, improving our understanding of the linkages between small arms and light weapons and CRSV by supporting research specifically in the national context. And this is really came up a lot in the research that this is also very contextual. And some of the weapons, that are used are maybe not firearms, and they're maybe more traditional weapons or blunt objects. And this is something that needs to be addressed, but perhaps in a different way. We should also improve and support disaggregated data collection efforts by all actors, including civil society. We should improve medical data. So I didn't give this example before, but in addition to the public data that we collected, we also collected data from hospitals, which were given to us confidentially, and it was sort of aggregated and anonymized. And this data, for example, MSF in the DRC, which had data on 10,000 survivors, did identify that about 60% of these survivors were attacked by a weapon. However, they didn't disaggregate in terms of the type of weapon. And going forward, the disaggregation of type of weapon is a really important issue that can really help both CRSV prevention efforts, but also the arms control community. And I think it's something that is being more and more considered. And if we're talking about data, we can also look at the UN monitoring and analysis and reporting arrangement. This could mean, for example, collecting more information on weapons, making it a formal category for analysis. It could also mean the inclusion of arms control and disarmament experts from the mission in the MARA coordination group, which usually comes together to discuss and review incidents. And importantly, I think this national level incident-based data should be made accessible to arms control practitioners, including national authorities on small arms, export licensing officers, practitioners implementing DDR and WAM to sort of inform the way they do their work. And here I'm talking about, not sharing sensitive information, but rather trends and aggregate trends on weapons. I think, beyond collecting the data and making it available, it's important that the data leads to informing early actions. This could be in the form of integrating weapons-related issues in capacity building with security forces and national authorities. This is something that the UN, through the Senior Women's Protection Advisors, have been doing capacity building sessions, and maybe further integration into weapons issues can be considered. It should lead to real-time responses, as I mentioned, such as setting up weapons-free zones, implementing weapons collection programs where we think that the risk of weapons is really affecting CRSV incidents. And it could also lead to advocacy and engagement at a high level. So, as I mentioned, the Office of the Special Representative, who can engage with militaries on these issues, but also the Security Council, who can, based on this, better can leverage arms embargoes as part of sanction regimes, but also better monitor these embargoes as in relation to conflict-related sexual violence. So I will stop here and thank you very much for this. Thanks, Frida.
Thank you, Hana, for sharing these findings and the data that is available on weapons and conflict-related sexual violence. I'd now like to turn to Sulaima Ishaq. Sulaima, and when we will also stop sharing the screen. So Sulaima, can you please provide us with an overview on the current situation in Sudan in relation to sexual violence and weapons, and also any reflections you might have on the findings of Hana's study? Thank you. Over to you, Sulaima. Sulaima, if you can please unmute.
Actually, I have a small presentation. Thank you, Hana, for the finding. And thank you all for listening and actually inviting me to this very important roundtable. I also want to share a presentation that I have already presented within the conference of sexual violence, the politics of sexual violence and conflict, case as Sudan as case study, which have been conducted in Nairobi and early in the 23rd and 24th of November. And it was all about giving an overview of things. And because I don't have all the technical technical help for putting the presentation on, I send it to Hana. If it's possible, she can put it on. Actually, the conflict-related sexual violence I'm talking about, it's also defined, is the well-defined conflict-related sexual violence by the UN that have been defined within the different resolutions that's come out with the UN Security Council and the special representative of combating sexual violence and conflict within the UN. So we are using the same definition. Already Sudan had signed in the 2020, they had signed already a framework of cooperation between the government and the UN Special Representative Office of combating sexual violence and conflict. So we already have an obligations as a country. towards ending sexual violence in conflict. That's before this conflict is going on. And it's a very political how people are using sexual violence as a weapon of war, and I'm not going to indulge into this because you see that in different phases, women and girls in Sudan have actually been the first people who have been actually paying the price of any conflict, any political setup, even the deterioration of the economic. معلش بس بالراحة معلش بس even the deterioration of the economical situation, we have been paying the high price of it. So mostly we are paying this price in this conflict by a lot of things have been losing their safety, security, their houses, their homes, their savings. So they have been actually forced to flee and leave, or if not fleeing and leaving, they will be evacuating by force, using sexual violence as one of the tools to make people evacuate their houses. So we can skip all this kind of narrative about the Sudanese women dire situation and get into the various forms, because we have been experiencing all the various forms of conflict-related sexual violence, apart from sexual slavery, kidnapping, forced marriage, forced pregnancy, and all of this. So and documentation have been actually through services. That's why we speak about, like, we only speak about 2%. If we're talking about the data we have, it's only the 2% of what's really happening on the ground, especially when you're comparing this to the distribution of services, especially in Khartoum or in Darfur. Especially that's what I mean, that's Nyala and Jenaina. And we lost the Jenaina since that people mostly have been left to Adri, Chad. So we lost even the sources, and we lost even the people who you've been using documenting issues and been referring to the services. And when I talk about Nyala, we have been, the last time we got reports, it was 2 months ago. Since that, because RSF had took fully control of the whole region, so it's even much more at risk to get new data and women to get actually support for sexual violence that's happening to them. So I will talk immediately about what's happening now in Khartoum and providing the number of that we have been documenting, which is 136 incidents of sexual violence, of conflict-related sexual violence that's happened in the conflict zones. That's, I mean, Khartoum, Jenaina, and Nyala, South Darfur. And when you talk about the narrative of that people that's happening to them, because most of the documentations happening during the services provided, this health services provided, we don't have, especially in Khartoum, we don't have people could report to the police or something. It's only hospitals, and people could get to the hospitals who could actually report sexual violence. Most of the injuries of the sexual violence happened because most of the sexual violence happened inside houses, and inside houses, full armed control is used. It's armed people coming in inside the houses, because as women who are still living in Khartoum and girls, they took staying at their houses, not going out of it, as some kind of protection mechanism against sexual violence. It's not protecting them from bullets. It's not protecting them from being bombed, but actually they think it protects them from sexual violence. Unfortunately, most of the sexual violence happen they commit sexual violence doing this, and to do this, they are doing this under the threat of guns. And most of the injuries that women have been having during the sexual violence is not by the sexual violence itself. Most of it's or something by the small arms, which is being used to threat or to hit when somebody is resisting. So it mostly they have injuries, and sometimes they shoot actually at the feet of the people in the survivor family or friends or people who are with the survivor. They shoot at their head, at their feet as a threat. So they receive full threat of arms, shooting, threatening, and putting the arms in their heads, or using the small arm itself as a weapon to hit them in their heads. It give injury. They don't kill them, but actually they injure them in a way that they could not actually scream or resist or anything. And even that people cannot resist, because when using a weapon, it's terrifying enough. Within the 136 incidents, we have 2 incidents that happened by civilian, but actually it's armed robbery. They came as to rob, and then they are fully armed, because now in Khartoum, everywhere you can find there's no control of arms, of course, and you can purchase, or even you can find just arms in the street. So it's easy that people can get access to different types of small arms, actually, which is very much unfortunate. And these 2 incidents had happened because armed civilian had been breaking into houses and threatening other civilians under the control of arms. And so it become like a feature. Most of the incidents of sexual violence that's happened and took place now in Khartoum, or taking place now, or some of the unreported cases, mostly that happened under the threat of small arms. So it was very much connected. And actually it had been, some of the women, they report when the narrative about sexual violence, when they are in the checkpoint, if they are not faced by the threat of arm, they may negotiate the situation, you see, about like they will pass, or trying to tell the soldier, let us pass, or we'll come back, something. But when they find them armed, they don't speak. They don't say anything, because it's not even wise. It's either losing your life or getting exposed to sexual violence. And that's why we always combat this narrative that's saying it's worse than death. It's not more than death, because life as a value is much more valuable than anything else. So sometimes you put some kind of advice, which is, because this is all we have. You cannot say to the people that you don't get out of their houses, but actually tell them if they are getting in the threat of sexual violence, they put their life as much more value. They have to save their life. Whatever happens, they have to save their lives. Because even when they're resisting, sometimes if they're injured by the weapon or even get shooted, they will die. So actually, the value of their life is much more, people should be looking at the value of their life, surviving what's happening to them. This is mostly what's happening. And that's why even in the, people are getting very much terrified when they are getting evacuated, even because all the checkpoints, they also find armed people. And if they are, because some people have actually getting some small arms when they're getting evacuated to protect themselves, like the man in the family or anybody in the member of the family. If they actually, the soldiers find any kind of arm within those civilians, it's also bring more of threat to them. So it's actually either you are holding it because to protect yourself, or because you are threatened by a small arm. So it's very much connected to what's happening in Sudan right now. And that's why people now are connecting guns to the threat of sexual violence, even in their stories, even in their narratives, even when they're speaking about, even when they're speaking about resilience and speaking about surviving and speaking about this, it's very much connected in the narrative of the survivors or the narrative of the people coming and surviving the war. Maybe they're not surviving sexual violence, but actually they already survived the war, where they're also threatened by small arms. And the threat of small arms made them either evacuate or either providing money or providing their own savings to protect themselves from being attacked. And they know that if people having a small arm and attack them and they have women, they may be 80% exposed to sexual violence. That's all I can talk about in relation to sexual violence and small arms, because there's so many aspects, the politics of sexual violence in Sudan, but it's not maybe relevant to all things related to the roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sulaima. We're very grateful for that you took the time to be here and to share with us these difficult realities. I'll now directly turn to Mayada Adil. So Mayada, over to you to tell a bit in 10 minutes from your perspective, what can be done by civil society, international community to better prevent CRSV in Sudan. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for having me and having this special case of Sudan during this difficult time, while all the attention is taken to another conflicts in this world. And thank you, Sulaima, for the updates from the ground. We know the number are increasing, and I'm hoping that I come with solution from youth perspective, and therefore I believe that in order to address the conflict-related sexual violence in Sudan, it requires a comprehensive approach that engage and empower young people as an active change maker. But before I go on in the strategies that the civil society and international community can adopt to combat the conflict-related sexual violence in the immediate and long term, I would like to remind us all that with a couple of points that haven't changed since I made my statement in the United Nations Security Council on the 12th of September. Well, I have the obligation to remind you all that Sudanese women and youth are brave. They were in the front lines of the 2019 revolution with their resilience and outstanding efforts to make the peace. And now, by actively engaging in the humanitarian assistance in emergency rooms and community-based organizations, and mostly women-led group, who are mobilizing resources from the community and working voluntarily with the diaspora. Sulaima is one of those people. But since the war erupted, their political spheres and spaces have been diminished. They've been excluded from all the discussions, and including regionally and internationally, from the initiative that actually willing to end the war. As we hear today, looking for solution to prevent the conflict-related sexual violence in the 16 days of activism, we demand our political participation to be a priority, to call for more women and youth from the advocacy groups and civil society to be in the table of negotiations that are ongoing, because no one better than the women and youth to address those conflict-related sexual violence. I have also pointed fairly to the injustice that we have faced as a Sudanese people. We have witnessed the global humanitarian financial system focusing their aid on countries in the global north, and to the recent war Israel launched against the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, neglecting the humanitarian crisis we are facing in Sudan. Therefore, the international community, as Sudan being part of it, has the responsibility to provide humanitarian relief, including house-saving assistance, women in different population and states needed, especially the Sudanese refugees in neighboring country. So we demand accountability and justice for those women. because there is no peace unless there is justice for those women. Their bodies are used as a weapon of war in this conflict. So in order to go further with my proposed strategies, we'll start by what we can be done to better prevent the conflict-related sexual violence. First, we need to empower youth as an agent of change. We need to recognize their importance and engage them in the advocacy in prevention initiatives, and encouraging them to lead campaigns and organize workshops and create educational materials to raise awareness about what's going on. Already the youth activists, they're using their social media platforms to speak about what's going on in Sudan, about the genocide and the increasing numbers of those violations. But it's not enough, obviously, to bring more attention, and we demand that to be also in partnership with international institutions, and to be accessible to young people, to have this partnership with the other international institutions. Of course, to promote gender equality and education, we need to have more awareness about what's going on, and we need to bridge the gap between the youth and authority, facilitate dialogue between the youth and community leaders, government officials, and security forces to foster understanding and collaboration in addressing meaningfully this conflict of sexual violence, and encouraging youth participation in peace-building efforts and decision-making processes to ensure their voices are heard and their needs are considered. Also encourage youth-led reporting and documentation. I think this is a very, very important point. As we all know, the UN fact-finding mission been involved by Sudan Civil Society Organization, as it was the decision of the Human Rights Council made on the 20th of September this year. So should this mission support the youth-led initiative, and we have many on the ground in Sudan, and also in the Sudanese activists that moved to the neighboring countries, collect the data and information of the incidents and ensure confidentiality and protection of the survivor themselves. Of course, Sulaima knows I have spoke with many survivors of the sexual violence, and been talking about the most important thing, that they want to continue their education, they want to have a psychological support and healing trauma. And I think one of the things that they're mostly young women, young age, and I think if we can manage to empower those women and themselves, they become an agent of change and help other women and other girls and young girls to speak up and to find a path of healing for them. So we need a mechanism and a very sensitive psychological support services for those young survivors. Counseling, group therapy, and community support programs to help them cope with their new life after the trauma, with the emotional and psychological impact of this violence. I think this is a very important point. And also youth activists themselves on the ground and in diaspora, because it's becoming very difficult, and we face a lot of conflict and genocide. We've seen it on front of our eyes, and we need to find a mechanism to support all the youth activists and all the survivors as well. So we need to promote peace building and conflict resolution. And I think one of the important points to have a positive impact on this, to recognize and celebrate the youth activism, acknowledging the efforts of the young people. They are actively working to prevent and address the conflict-related sexual violence. I think from us as well, we need to be provided by a mentorship and opportunities for leadership development for all the youth, and also those women that have been survived, and recognition for their contribution to the social change. Hoping by implementing those youth-led and youth-centric strategies can effectively address the conflict-related sexual violence in Sudan and in the globe. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Mayada, for sharing these concrete solutions and recommendations and valuable insights. Very helpful. We will now turn to some of the arms control instruments that can support also CRSV prevention. And one of the political instruments is the Program of Action on Small Arms that Hana also mentioned, which recognized where states have recognized the links between small arms proliferation and sexual violence in conflict. And in June next year, states will get together to review the implementation of this program of action, which is also an opportunity to connect and bring in some of these recommendations. But with that, I'll also leave over to our last two speakers today. From UNODC, Sven, Pfeiffer, and Menn, who will tell a bit about UNODC's efforts in supporting prevention and response, and how arms control in particular as the Firearms protocol in particular can support the prevention of CRSV. So Sven works in the crime prevention and criminal justice section in UNODC, focusing on gender in the criminal justice system. And Max is with the Firearms trafficking section, supporting member states in preventing and combating the illicit manufacturing of and trafficking in firearms and ammunition. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frida. If you allow me, I would start just with a few broader reflections on our work on CRSV from different angles, and then hand it over to Max for the firearms-related aspects. As you may know, many of our mandated work streams at UNODC relate to CRSV, including work on trafficking in person, terrorism prevention, as well as justice responses to violence against women and violence against children. Concerning Sudan specifically, we partnered this year with the UN team of experts on sexual violence in conflict to conduct a study, unfortunately cut short by the outbreak of the conflict in April. And that study focused on the realities of victims of sexual violence when they take the very brave decision to seek justice, and how the criminal justice system responds or fails to respond to reported cases. And I want to acknowledge the contribution of Sulaima, who has collaborated on this and is maybe in a much better position than me to talk about this. The findings highlight the need for scaling up efforts to support law reform, procedural law, policy guidance, institutional reforms, training for criminal justice institutions, but also victim and survivor support services, forensics, data collection, and greater accountability and oversight also over institutions with regard to sexual violence offenses. So obviously the study focused on criminal justice responses, so it didn't reveal anything new in relation to the use of weapons, but I think some of the challenges identified are important when it comes to addressing the use of weapons in justice responses to CRSV. So one of them is that very few cases involving armed forces are actually in the criminal justice system. And this is possibly related to the difficulty for prosecutors to proceed with charges against members of the police or armed forces or security forces, especially because current procedures make it subject to the permission of executive bodies, which often deny requests by prosecutors, even in the limited cases that are in the system, to withdraw the immunity that police and security officials have. And one point I wanted to make before handing it over from our broader work on gender-based violence against women is to stress the importance of addressing weapons as a matter of prevention and response, which is very clear, and I would like to highlight three aspects from this perspective. First of all, we have international standards that call for data collection on the use of weapons to commit such violence. And while we know that access to the presence of firearms is a key risk factor with regard to intimate partner violence and gender-related killing of women by intimate partner, we do lack similarly detailed data on firearms and sexual violence by non-partners. And our hope is that member states will use the new UN statistical framework on femicide, which goes beyond the intimate partner context, to get more disaggregated data on sexual violence and other forms of violence, lethal violence, disaggregated by mode of killing and the use of firearm. Secondly, criminal justice responses address the issue of weapons, but usually in individual cases. For example, when justice officials should consider the risk posed by the availability and the use of weapons when they carry out lethality risk assessments and support victims and survivors in safety planning. And courts should restrict the use and possession of firearms when it comes to protection orders or sentences. But more importantly, we have evidence on what works in prevention, and that indicates that the presence of weapons is a key risk factor at the community level. And we also know that strategies that are proven to reduce the incidence of GBV include measures to make environment safe. And this is why I think arms control and efforts to stop firearms trafficking are so crucial for the prevention, not just of CRSV, but also of sexual and intimate partner violence more broadly, thinking also of the continuum of violence that Hana and others have mentioned. With that, over to you, Max.
Thanks, Sven, and this is indeed a very good transition to what I'm trying to address, which is weapons in the CRSV context. And I would have to clarify that we, as the Firearms Trafficking section, have not been working in Sudan. So what I'm going to address right now is more some general thoughts, but of course, in my view, these would also be applicable to any conflict, including the conflict in Sudan. I would like to focus on three areas: the supply side on small arms and light weapons, research and analysis, and effective national firearms licensing regimes. Let me start by the supply side. We have already heard, and I think Sulaima was very clear in her words, how firearms or small arms are involved in various incidences of CRSV. In very different forms also. It can be lethal, but it can also be just the threat of firearms. And I don't want to use the word just, it can be the threat of firearms. And therefore, preventing access to illicit firearms is indeed a crucial component when it comes to CRSV. And this requires effective arms control and weapons and ammunition management to prevent the diversion of firearms or small arms and light weapons. And it also requires effective criminal justice responses to prevent and combat illicit manufacturing and trafficking, and also any kind of firearms diversion. And this is where the Firearms Protocol, an UN protocol which is supplementing the Organized Crime Convention, comes into play, because this instrument indeed is a major guiding and legally binding tool actually for member states to address, prevent and combat illicit trafficking and illicit manufacturing of firearms. Similarly, also in the outcome document of the last year's biannual meeting of states to the program of action, which is, as Frida already rightly said, another important political instrument on small arms and light weapons, mentioned that eradicating illicit arms trafficking is indeed a key part in combating gender-based violence and CRSV. Coming from the illicit firearms and illicit possession of firearms, which can be used in CRSV, to the legal arms trade, which is also an important component in preventing CRSV. And I think it was Hana who already pointed out Article 7 of the Arms Trade Treaty, which is indeed crucial, or it was crucial when it was adopted and still is, to prevent that arms are exported. And there are just few arms exporting countries worldwide, that these countries export arms to contexts where there is the risk that the arms might be used to commit or facilitate serious acts of gender-based violence or serious acts of violence against women and children. If countries do a risk assessment, like arms exporting countries do a risk assessment, and they realize that there is such overriding risk, they shall not export arms to these countries. And this, of course, is important because it does not only affect let's say, small non-state armed groups and their access mostly to illicit firearms, but also instances where governmental security forces do have access to arms and might misuse these arms to commit cases of CRSV and gender-based violence. The Arms Trade Treaty does not have any enforcement provisions itself, doesn't have any criminal offenses, but this is again also where the Firearms Protocol comes into play, because if potentially arms exporting countries do not authorize an arms export because they realize that these arms might be used to commit gender-based violence, and people, manufacturers, brokers export arms anyways, this would be considered as trafficking and can be criminalized, illicit firearms trafficking. This leads me to the next point, research and analysis. Why is that? I said, like, arms exporting countries shall not export arms if there's a risk of that these arms might be used to commit gender-based violence. But how do we know? This requires a solid information on the incidences. And again, it's not only it's not sufficient to only assess those cases where there have been firearms used lethal and people or women were killed with these firearms, but any forms of CRSV is important to assess. And without such data, arms exporting countries would not know, or they can at least say they didn't know that there are cases of gender-based violence in the countries and therefore continue to export arms. So indeed, data collection is very important, not only to understand the issue, but also to have a clear a baseline if arms cannot be exported in such countries. There have been various resolutions of the Organized Crime Convention, for example, where there was a call to member states to collect gender and age disaggregated data, also data on armed violence against women and hate crimes. And again, this is very important for two aspects: to understand the issue and also to have a knowledge base for arms exports, and most likely or ideally to prevent such exports where there is a risk of diversion and a risk of using arms for gender-based violence. And I think it was also said, and it's an important point, of course, firearms do have or do impact men and women very differently. And it's important to understand this. Indeed, the majority of people in possession of firearms are men, and also the majority of victims of firearms homicide are men. But it should not be neglected that also, indeed, that there are cases, for example, in Nigeria, where more and more women also are involved in firearms trafficking. So it's not only the victimization side, but it's also what we would have to understand how women might also actively participate in firearms trafficking. But in most cases, this have very different root causes. So whereas men usually traffic firearms for profit or as a tool of power, in the case of Nigeria, it was the research found out that mainly poverty was the main driver for trafficking, where women were involved. So you see, they're very different root causes, and it's very important to understand the underlying these underlying root causes and how firearms trafficking and the use of firearms impacts women and men differently. And then the last point I would like to mention is the effective national control over firearms. This might be particularly important in the context of post-conflict context, because UNODC homicide data shows that the most dangerous place for women is their home. Sven was already speaking about intimate partner violence. The risk that a woman is killed by their partner multiplies by a factor of 5 if there's a firearm in their household. This is, of course, then raising the question, who should have access to firearms and who can take firearms back home when we speak about, for example, security forces. And this requires very good and solid licensing criteria. So, for example, people that have been perpetrated gender-based violence in the past, that have received restraint orders or similar, they can be excluded from possessing firearms in national licensing regimes. So this is a question of national legislation and how national licensing regimes are framed. I would like to stop with these 3 points and hand over back to Frida. Thank you.
Thank you, Max, and thank you, Sven, for this intervention. It's clear that the UN framework still has a role to play, but that there's definitely scope to do more also in the area of CRSV. So with that, thanks to all panelists for your contributions, and we'll now have about 15-20 minutes left for questions and comments from questions from our participants. So as we said before, please use you can use the raise your hand function if you'd like to take the floor. You can also use the Q&A to write questions, and we will perhaps take a few questions at a time. I do not see any hands as of yet, but please feel free to raise. And perhaps in the meantime, we do have one question that has in the Q&A from one of our UN Action focal points in OCHA, who's asking Sulaima to please share some ways that the UN and our members can better monitor and provide meaningful advocacy on this, and anything that is working or not working that could be changed. I saw, Sulaima, you already provided an answer, but perhaps can I ask you to perhaps take the floor and answer this question?
Actually, I found the questions and then I tried to answer, and then I just went on leave by accident. Because of the dire situation, that dire humanitarian situation, we need an advocacy not only just for small arms collection, but actually because responding to the humanitarian situation now within Sudan is crucial, because we have to prepare for ourselves for the post-conflict era. And without responding to what's happening right now, we are not going to be preparing ourselves. And I mean by preparing ourselves is about implementation of the 1325 National Plan, where armed control, disarmament, and rehabilitation are within those plans. And it's a national plan where all these things are articulated. And even though some of it might be needing amendment, but at least this national plan is all about building peace and about enhancing this building peace through the armed collection, the disarmament, and the rehabilitation of people that have been within the armed forces. And of course, there is a gender responsive security sector reform, which is the crucial for all these things to end. And putting an end to conflict-related sexual violence in Sudan is one of the issues that's related very much to the armed control and collection of small arms, because this will put an end to the using sexual violence within conflict and within unsafe areas and within armed groups, because there will be, after war, there will other more armed groups will appear, and we have to prepare for that. Using of sexual violence will be much of the things that people are using most of the time. We have been seeing that before. So it's more advocacy for 1325 to be implemented and people to be prepared, community resilience, where people actually could implement 1325. If they're in a position of not responding to their needs and their humanitarian situation, they cannot be actually part. And without people and without survivors and without the community, we're not going to do any kind of implementation of 1325 successful. Thank you. Especially when you talk about small arms and people holding arms to protect themselves in a position where they could be threatened most of the time. And we will have this kind of fear most of the time that if you're not armed, you will be attacked, because we have been peaceful people and then things happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Sulaima, for this response. Thank you. I will now give the floor to Miyo Akita from the Permanent Mission of Japan. You have your hand up, so over to you, please, to unmute. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frida. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well.
Wonderful. Hi. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the co-organizers for the latest updates and highlighting the dire situation in Sudan. My name is Mio Akita. I'm a WPS and gender expert from the Permanent Mission of Japan. And Japan has a higher interest in the situation on the ground in Sudan and would like to continue discussion on the situation with the partner organizations and member states. And I have a specific question to the UNODC colleague on the data collection on femicide and also intimate partner violence. We are pretty much aware of the latest framework on femicide, and I would be grateful if you could elaborate a little more on the challenges in national data collection, because I am aware of a lot of challenges probably in the statistical capacity of each country, or perhaps on the agreement of the definition. And I would be grateful if you could elaborate a little more on this side. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Akita. And I'll leave over to Max and Sven, who would like to respond, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this question. Unfortunately, I'm not the data expert, so please forgive me any inaccuracies, but I do have a general understanding of the new framework. So the framework basically responds to the need to have at least a statistical definition. We did have an intergovernmental process on femicide. It ended up being called gender-related killings of women and girls, which reflects the different legal and conceptual positions that exist among member states. But now with the technical work of the data experts in UNODC and UN Women, we managed to get this framework done, and it was actually approved by the UN Statistical Commission last year. So it has the endorsement of member states. And it basically provides a statistical definition of femicide or feminicide or gender-related killings, whatever you want to call it, responding to the fact that homicide data, if it's disaggregated, at the moment, the maximum you can get is a disaggregation by the type of perpetrator in the relationship to the victim. But even within the countries that report homicide data to UNODC, there's only a small number of countries that provide this disaggregation. But we know that femicide also is not limited to the intimate context, right? There's also sexual violence-related femicide, as well as organized crime-related femicide, where it's not about necessarily the link between the victim and the perpetrator, but about specific modus operandi. For example, using extreme violence, exposing the body in the public to send a message to a rival group. So all these factors, there's actually 8, are included in the statistical framework. And it's based on another product that our office has developed, the International Classification of Crime for Statistical Purposes, which assists national statistics offices to move away from an offense-based definition of statistical data collection towards a conduct-based definition to make it more easy to compare across jurisdictions which have different definitions of crime. So these are the 2 main reference documents. I will share them now in the chat, and I'm happy to provide any more details, even bilaterally if necessary.
Thank you, Sven. Would Max, do you have anything to add? Or otherwise, if I can also, perhaps Hana would like to come in on the data question as well.
Not much on the femicide question, but these difficulties in good data continues, of course, also on the firearms side of the equation. So the first one is that many countries, we do have in UNODC, we have different data collection initiatives. One for homicide, which also resulted in the femicide study, which was published right now. Then we have a data collection initiative on firearms, and we see that only a few countries can report data, like good and solid data on firearms. And the question, where did the firearms come from? How many firearms did you seize, and so on? And then, of course, in this specific context, on the question, the firearms which were used to commit gender-based violence, where did these firearms come from? Were they licensed firearms? Were they illicit firearms? So this, and just to complement what Sven was saying, this is indeed major statistical difficulties we have and major capacity issues we have with the countries, where we try to support countries in actually being able to collect, disaggregate, and analyze this data on conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based violence on the one hand side, but also on the use of firearms in these forms of violence. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Max, for that addition. We don't have any hands up. If there's anyone who'd like the floor, please raise your hand for sharing any comments from your perspectives or any questions to our panelists, or put in the Q&A. Let's see. We do have one question from Lindsay now, asking us, UN Action is a network that brings together 25 UN entities to address conflict-related sexual violence. Lindsay is asking if any of the panelists see gaps in the existing guidance and capacity building needed to better integrate arms control into or disarmament into the conflict-related sexual violence prevention and response. So what kind of guidance capacity is needed for better making that link in the CRSV communities and networks? Are there any of our panelists who feel called to respond?
Thanks, Frida, and thanks, Lindsay, for that question. I think it's a really good question, and it also relates to the data collection question, specifically data collection within the context of a UN mission and how this is shared with other actors, and specifically actors that are working on conflict-related sexual violence prevention. So I think one of the things that missions can do is to update the information requirements, sort of protocol of the mission, to really include information about gender-based violence at the different types, including CRSV and the presence of a weapon in those incidents. Now, I know that data on weapons can get quite technical. So I think that, guidance and training of CRSV practitioners or others in the mission who are collecting data could be quite useful to know what type of information to record. And apart from that, I think even very basic disaggregation weapon type, like was it a firearm or was it a blunt object, can really help in furthering the understanding of this issue on the ground. So I'll leave it there and see if my other panelists have anything to add as well.
Thank you, Hana, for that response. And please, we are approaching the end of our session, but please, other panelists, and especially also Mayada, if you have any last calls to share, even not on the data question, but anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up as well? Or any of our other panelists? Yes, Sven, please.
Just a very short reflection in order, I think, Lindsay, in addition to capacity building and tools, I think maybe one suggestion we could make is to document the issue in more detail, perhaps in the SG's report on CRSV. I think Hana's study and UNIDIR, UNODC study has provided a lot of in-depth insight, and would be great to see that reflected perhaps also in the SG's report. I only found one reference when I did a text search to firearms. I'm sure there's much that could be said in this very short but important global report.
Thank you, Sven, for highlighting that point too. So, Mayada, would you have any
Yes.
final comments? Over to you, please.
I would say thank you so much for having me, and it was a very fruitful conversation and meaningful discussion. I would just like always to continue talking about what's going on in Sudan, and I would ask all the viewers to shed light on what's going on and participate. And I know we need to talk more about what's going on in Sudan, and we need to support the youth activists either on the ground and in the diaspora, because it's heavy on us. It's like a burden. We always demand, and we always in those international spheres, and we talk about what's going on, what we want and what we demand, but we want to see more meaningful implementation on what we want regarding the prevention. And we put our strategies, we put our policies in perspective. We would like to be taken in consideration as we want to see an impact of what we are advocating for. And that's what I would like to be my final words. And thank you again for having us.
Thank you, Mayada, for being here. To all of you for being here. Sulaima, did you have a final comment? I saw your hand or your.
Actually, I just want to put your attention to a very important factor, because there is a narrative, a political narrative about sexual violence that's taking place now in the country. And we know how much as any kind of security sector reforms that's within it, it will be arm control and collection of arm will be with it. It's much more political process. We know it's yes, training, changing attitude and things, but it should be within political process and within political will. And with the high polarization that's happening in the country, we have to very much be aware of the political narrative that's actually explaining the sexual violence. It's very dangerous, and it could be endangering the process of combating and ending sexual violence in conflict, because a lot of narrative is actually explaining and putting excuses for sexual violence that's happening related to conflict, and that's what sexual violence as a weapon of war, and within that, the armed control and the very responsive, gender responsive security sector reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Sulaima, for highlighting the power of the narrative as well. So with that, we are going to go to the closing segment of this session. And you'll see in the chat soon a feedback form. We strongly encourage you to also fill out this at the end of the session, and welcome any honest feedback on future sessions or engagement. And now I would like to hand over to Lindsay for Sven again for the final close our event and remarks. So over to you, Lindsay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frida, for your excellent moderation of this event, as well as your efforts in supporting the organization of this event. And to all UN Action members, I also really want to thank Sven and Max from UNODC for your interventions. And on behalf of the UN Action Secretariat Network, I also really want to thank our co-organizers, UNIDIR and Alina, also for your engagement and for Switzerland's long-standing support of the CRSV agenda, including in the Security Council. It needs to be said a very special thanks to each of our panelists, especially Sulaima and Mayada, for your incredible insights and sharing all of your very important work on Sudan. And thank you to the participants for tuning in today. I think a lot of very important points have been raised. Also, some very concrete recommendations were made that we've taken note of. and we will continue to reflect and integrate these recommendations in our efforts to prevent and respond conflict-related sexual violence, especially in Sudan, as a network. So thank you again in advance for sharing your feedback with us in the form. As Frida mentioned, it's now in the chat. And again, a video recording of this session will be available on UNIDIR's YouTube channel and UN Action's website if you have colleagues or other experts who are covering this thematic or Sudan that you may want to share it with. So I'm wishing everyone now a very good day wherever you may have joined us from, and hope that you can join us for a future roundtable discussion. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.